Counterparts. The bell rang furiously, and when Miss Parker went to the tube, a furious voice called out in a piercing North of Ireland accent, "Send Farrington out here!" Miss Parker returned to her machine, saying the man who was writing at a desk, "Mr. Alleyne wants you upstairs." The man muttered, "Blast him!" under his breath and pushed back his chair to stand up. When he stood up, he was tall and of great bulk. He had a hanging face, dark wine-colored, with his fair eyebrows and moustache. His eyes bulged forward slightly, and the whites of them were dirty. He lifted up the counter and, passing by clients, went out of the office with a heavy step. He went heavily upstairs until he came out to the second landing, where a door bore a brass plate with the inscription "Mr. Alleyne." He had halted, puffing with labor and vexation, then knocked. A shrill voice cried, "Come in!" The man entered Mr. Alleyne's home. Simultaneously, Mr. Alleyne, a little man wearing gold-rimmed glasses and a clean-shaven face, shot his head upward over a pile of documents. The head itself was so pink and hairless that it seemed like a large egg reposing on the papers. Mr. Alleyne did not lose a moment. "Farrington, what is the meaning of this? Why have I always to complain to you? Farrington, what is the meaning of this? Why have I always to complain of you? May I ask why you haven't made a copy of the contract between Bodley and Kerwayne? I told you it must be ready by 4 o'clock. But Mr. Sheila said, sir. But Mr. Shelley said, sir. Mr. Shelley said, sir. Kindly attend to what I say, not what Mr. Shelley says, sir. You have always some excuse or another for shirking work. Let me tell you that if this contract is not copied before this evening, I'll lay the matter before Mr. Crosby. Do you hear me now? Yes, sir. Do you hear me now? Aye, and another little matter. I might as well be talking to the wall as talking to you. Understand me once and for all, that you get a half an hour of your lunch and not an hour and a half. How many courses do you want? I'd like to know. Do you mind me now? Yes, sir. Mr. Alleyne bent his head again upon his pile of papers. The man stared fixedly at the polished skull which directed the affairs of Crosby and Allen, gauging its fragility. A spasm of rage gripped his throat for a few moments and then passed, leaving it after a sharp sensation of thirst. A man recognized the sensation, felt that he must have a good night's drinking. The middle of the month was past, and if he could get the copy done in time, Mr. Alleyne might give him an order on the cashier. He stood up still, gazing fixedly at the head upon the pile of papers. Suddenly, Mr. Alleyne became upset at all the papers, searching for something. Then, as if he had been unaware of the man's presence until that moment, he shot his head up again, saying, "Hey! What are you going... Hey! Are you going to stand there all day? Upon my word, Farrington, you take things easy!" "I was waiting to see." "Very good. You needn't wait to see. Go downstairs and do your work." The man walked heavily towards the door, and as he went out of the room, he heard Mr. Alleyne cry after him as if the contract was not copied by evening. Mr. Crosby would hear of the matter. He returned to his desk in the lower office and counted the sheets which remained to be copied. He took up his pen and dipped it in ink, but he continued to stare stupidly at the last words he had written. "In no case shall the said Bernard Bodley be." The evening was failing falling. Fuck! The evening was falling, and in a few minutes they would be lighting the gas. Then he could write. He felt that he must slake the thirst in his throat. He stood up from his desk, lifting the counter as before, passed out at the office. He passed out of the office. As he was passing out, the chief clerk looked at him inquiringly. "It's all right, Mr. Shelley," said the man, pointing his finger to indicate the objective of his journey. The chief clerk glanced at the hat rack, but seeing the row complete, offered no remark. As soon as he was on the landing, the man pulled a shepherd's plaid cap out of his pocket and put it in his head, and ran quickly down the rickety stairs. From the street door he walked on furtively on the inner side of the path towards the corner, and all at once dived into the doorway. He was safe now in the dark snug of O'Neill's shop, and filling up the little window that looked into the bar with his inflamed face, the color of dark wine or dark meat. He called out, "Hey, Pat, give us a GP, like a good fellow." The curate brought him a glass of plain porter. The man drank it all at a gulp, and asked for a caraway seed. He put his penny on the counter, leaving the curate to grope for it in the gloom. Retreated out of the snug, furtively as he had entered. Darkness, accompanied by thick fog, was gaining upon the dusk of February, and the lamps of Eustace Street had been lit. The man went up by the houses until he reached the door of the office, wondering whether he could finish his copy in time. On the stairs, the most pungent odor of few perfumes saluted his nose. Evidently, Miss Delacour had come while he was out in O'Neill's. He crammed his cap back again into his pocket and re-entered the office, assuming the air of absent-mindedness. "Mrs. Alahane has been calling for you," said the chief clerk severely. "Where were you?" Yeah. The man glanced at the two clients who were standing at the counters of the intimate, that their presence prevented him from answering. As the clients were both male, the chief clerk allowed himself to laugh. "I knew that game," he said. 5 times in one day is a little bit. Well, you better look sharp and get a copy of our correspondence to the Delano case for Mr. Alahane. The address and the presence of the public, his run upstairs, and the porter had gulped down so hastily confused the man, and as he sat down at his desk to get what was required, he realized how hopeless was the task of finishing this copy of the contract before 5:30. The dark, damp night was coming, and he longed to spend it in the bars, drinking with his friends, amid the glare of gas and clatter of glasses. He got out of Delacour correspondence and passed out of the office. He hoped Mr. Alahane would not discover the last 2 letters were missing. The moist, pungent perfume lay all the way up to Mr. Alahane's room. Miss Delacour was a middle-aged woman of Jewish appearance. Miss Alahane said to be sweet on her or her money. She came to the office often and stayed a long time. When she came, she was sitting beside his desk now in an aroma of perfumes, smoothing the handle of her umbrella and nodding the great black feather in her hat. Mr. Alahane had swiveled his chair round to her face and thrown his right foot jauntily upon his left knee. The man put the correspondence on the desk and bowed respectfully, but neither Mr. Alahane nor Miss Delacour took any notice of his bow. Mr. Alahane tapped a finger on the correspondence and then flicked it towards himself to say, "That's right, all. You can go." The man returned to the lower office and sat down at his desk. He stared intently at the incomplete phrase. "Is no case shall the said Bernard Bodley be." And the thought of how strange it was that the last 3 words began with the same letter. The chief clerk began to hurry Miss Parker, saying she would never have letters typed in time for post. The man listened to the clicking of the machine for a few hours and then set to work to finish his copy. But his head was not clear and his mind wandered away to the glare and the rattle of public house. It was the night for hot punches. He struggled with his copy, but when the clock struck 5, he had 14 pages to write. Blast it! He could not finish in time. He longed to excrete aloud, to bring his fist down on something violently. He was enraged that he wrote Bernard instead of Bernard and had to begin again on a clean sheet. He felt strong enough to clear out the whole office single-handed. His body ached to do something, to rush out and revel in violence at the indignities of his life enraged him. Could he ask the cashier privately for advance? No, the cashier was no good. No damn good. He wouldn't give an advance. He knew where he would meet the boys, Leonard and O'Halloran, and Nosey Flynn. The barometer of his emotional nature was set for a spell of riot. His name had so abstracted him that his name was called twice before he answered it. Mr. Alhaine and Miss Delacour were standing outside the counter, and all the clerks had turned around in anticipation of something. The man got up from his desk. Mr. Alhaine began a tirade of abuse, saying that 2 letters were missing. The man answered that he knew nothing about them, that he made a fateful copy. The tirade continued. It was so bitter and violent that the man could hardly restrain his fists from descending upon the head of the mannequin before him. "I know nothing about any other 2 letters," he said stupidly. "You know nothing. Of course, you know nothing," said Mr. Alhaine. "Tell me," he added, glancing first for approval at the lady beside him. "Do you take me for a fool? Do you think me an utter fool?" The man glanced from the lady's face to the little egg-shaped head and back again. Almost before he was aware of it, his tongue found a flirtatious moment. "I don't think so, sir," he said. "That's a fair question to put to me." There was a pause in the very breathing of the clerks. Everyone was astounded. The author of the witticism no less than his neighbors, and Miss Delacour, who was a stout, amiable person, began to smile broadly. Miss Adeline flushed to the hue of a wild rose, and his mouth twitched with a dwarf's passion. He shook his fist in a man's face till it seemed to vibrate like a knob of some electric machine. "You impertinent ruffian! You impertinent ruffian! I'll make short work of you. Wait till you see. You'll apologize to me for your impertinence, and you'll quit the office instant. You'll quit this, I'm telling you, or you'll apologize to me." He stood in the hallway opposite the office, watching to see if the cashier would come out alone. All the clerks passed out, and finally the cashier came out with the chief clerk. It was no use trying to say a word to him when he was with the chief clerk. The man felt that position was bad enough. He had been obliged to offer him an abject apology to Mr. Alhaine for his impertinence, but he knew what the hornet's nest of the office would be for him. He could remember the way in which Mr. Alhaine had hounded little Peake out of the office in order to make everyone else in the room for his own nephew. He felt savage, thirsty, and revengeful. Annoyed with him and everyone else, Mr. Alhaine would never give up an hour's rest. His life would be a hell to him. He made a proper fool of himself this time. Could he not keep his tongue in his cheek? but they never pulled together from the first. He and Mr. Alahane, ever since that day Mr. Alahane and him overheard him mimicking his North of Ireland accent to amuse Higgins and Miss Parker, that had been the beginning of it. He might have tried Higgins for the money, but sure Higgins had never anything to do himself. A man with 2 establishments to keep up, of course, he couldn't. He felt his great body aching for the comfort of the public house. Fog had begun to chill him, and he wondered he could touch Pat in O'Neill's. He could not touch him for more than a bob, and a bob was no use. Yet he must get money somewhere or another. He had spent his last penny for a GP, and soon it would be too late to get money anywhere. Suddenly, as if he was fingering his watch chain, he thought of Terry Kelly's pawn office in Fleet Street. That was the dodge! Why didn't he think of it sooner? He went through the narrow alley of Temple Bar, quickly muttering to himself that they could all go to hell because he was so going to have a night of it. The clerk and Terry Kelly said, "A crown?" But the connoisseur held out for 6 shillings, and at the end of 6 shillings was allowed him literally. He came out of the pawn office joyfully, making a little cylinder of the coins between his thumbs and fingers. In Westmoreland Street, the footpaths were crowded with young men and women returning from business, and ragged street urchins ran there here and there, yelling out the names of the evening editions. The man passed through the crowd, looking on the spectacle generally with proud satisfaction and staring masterfully at the office girls. His head was full of noises of tram, gongs, and swishing trolleys, and his nose already sniffed the curling fumes. Punch! As he walked on, he preconsidered the terms in which he would narrate the incident to the boys. So I just looked at him coolly, and looked at her, and then I looked back at him again, taking my time, and I don't think that's a fair question to put on me, says I. Nosey Flynn was sitting up in his usual corner of David Burns, and when he heard the story, he stood Farrington a half one, saying it was a smart thing as he ever heard. Farrington stood a drink in his turn. After a while, O'Halloran and Paddy Leonard came in, and the story was repeated to them. O'Halloran stood tailors of malt hots all round, and told the story of the retort he had made to the chief clerk when he was in Callan's of Fowler Street. But as the retort was after the matter of the liberal shepherds and eclogues, he had to admit that it was not as clever as Farrington's retort. At this, Farrington told the boys to polish off that and have another. Just as they were naming the poisons who should come in but Higgins. Of course, he had to join them with the others. The men asked him to give his version of it, and he did with great vivacity, for the sight of 5 small hot whiskies was very exhilarating. Everyone roared laughing when he showed in the way of Mr. Alahane shook his fist in Farrington's face, then imitated Farrington, saying, And here was my nabs, as cool as you please, while Farrington looked at the company out of his heavy, dirty eyes, smiling at the times, drawing forth straight drops of liquor from his mustache with the aid of his lower lip. When that round was over, there was a pause. O'Halloran had money, but neither of the two seemed to have any, so the whole party left the shop somewhat regretfully. At the corner of Duke Street, Higgins and Nosey Flynn beveled off to the left, while the other 3 turned back towards the city. Rain was drizzling down on the cold streets, and when they reached the ballast office, Farrington suggested the Scotch House. The bar was full of men, and loud with noise of tongues and glasses. The three men pushed past the whining match sellers at the door and formed a little party at the corner of the counter. They began to exchange stories. Leonard introduced them to a young fellow named Weathers, who was performing at the Tivoli as an acrobat and a knockabout artiste. Farrington stood a drink all around. Weathers said he would take a small Irish and Apollinaris. Farrington, who had definite notions of what was what, asked the boys would they have an Apollinaris too, but the boys told Tim to make theirs hot. The talk became theatrical. O'Halloran stood around, and then Farrington stood another. Weathers protested that the hospitality was too Irish. He promised to get them in behind the scenes and introduce them to some nice girls. O'Halloran said that he and Leonard would go, but that Farrington wouldn't go because he was a married man. And Farrington's heavy, dirty eyes leered at the company in token, and he understood that he was being chaffed. Weathers made them all just about one little tincture at his expense and promised to meet them later at Mulligan's in Poolbeg Street. When the Scotch House closed, they went round to Mulligan's. They went into the parlour and at the back, and O'Halloran ordered small hot specials all around. They were beginning to feel mellow. Farrington was just standing around the corner when Weathers came back. Much to Farrington's relief, he drank a glass of bitter this time. Funds were getting low, but they had enough to keep them going. Presently, two young women with big hats and a young man in a check suit came in and sat by the table. Weathers saluted them and told the company that they were out of the Tivoli. Farrington's eyes wandered at every moment in the direction of one of the young women. There was something striking in her appearance. An immense scarf of peacock blue muslin was worn around her hat and knotted in a great bow under her chin. She wore bright yellow gloves reaching to the elbow. Farrington gazed admiring at the plump arm, while she moved very often and with much grace. And when, after a little time, she answered his gaze, he admired her more dark, large, brown eyes. The oblique, staring expression in them fascinated him. She glanced at him once or twice. When the party was leaving, he brushed against his chin and said, "Oh, pardon," in a London accent. He watched her leave the room in the hope that she would look back at him, but he was disappointed. He cursed his want of money and cursed all the rounds he had stood, particularly all the whiskies and Apollinaris which he had stood to Weathers. If there was one thing he hated, it was a sponge. He was so angry, and he lost count of the conversation with his friends. When Paddy Leonard called him, he found that they were talking about feats of strength. Weathers was showing his biceps muscle to the company and boasting so much that the other two called on Farrington to uphold his national honor. Farrington pulled up his sleeve accordingly and showed his bicep muscle to the company. The two arms were examined and compared, and finally it was agreed to have a trial of strength. The table was cleared, and the two men rested their elbows on it, clasping hands. When Paddy Leonard said, "Go," each was to try to bring down the other's hand on the table. Farrington looked very serious and determined. The trial began. About 30 seconds, Weathers brought his opponent's hand down slowly to the table. Farrington's dark, wine-colored face flushed darker still with anger and humiliation after having been defeated by such a stripling. "You're not to put the weight of your body behind it. Play fair," he said. "Who's not playing fair?" said the other. "Come on, the best 2 out of 3. Trial began again. The veins stood out on Farrington's forehead, and the pallor of Weathers' complexion changed to peony. Their hands and arms trembled under stress after a long struggle. Weathers again brought his opponent's hand down slowly on the table. There was a murmur of applause from the spectators. The curate, who was standing behind the table, nodded his red head towards the victor and said with stupid familiarity, "Ah, that's a knack." "What the hell do you know about it?" said Farrington fiercely, turning on the man. What do you put your gab for? Shush, said O'Halloran, observing the violent expression on Farrington's face. Pony up, boys. We'll just have one little shama more and we'll be off. A very sullen-faced man stood at the corner of O'Connell Bridge waiting for the little Sandymount tram to take him home. He was full of smoldering anger and revengefulness. He felt humiliated and discontented. He did not even feel drunk, and he only had 2 pence in his pocket. He cursed everything he had done for himself in the office, pawned his watch, spent all his money, and had not even got drunk. He began to feel thirsty again, and he longed to be back in the hot, reeking public house. He had lost his reputation as a strong man, having been defeated twice by a mere boy. His heart swelled to fury when he thought of the woman in the big hat who had brushed up against him and said, "Pardon." His fury nearly choked him. His tram let him down at Shelburne Road and steered his great body along the shadow of a wall of the barracks. He loathed returning to his home. He went up by the side door and he found the kitchen empty and the kitchen fire was nearly out. He bawled upstairs, "Ada, Ada." His wife was a little sharp-faced woman who bullied her husband when he was sober and bullied him when he was drunk. They had 5 children. The boy came running down the stairs. "Who is that?" said the man, peering into the darkness. "Me, Pa." "Who are you, Charlie?" "No, Pa, Tom." "Where's your mother?" "She's out at the chapel." "That's right. Did you think of leaving any dinner for me?" "Yes, Pa. I light the lamp. What do you mean by having a place in the darkness? Are there other children in the bed?" The man sat down heavily on one of his chairs while the little boy lit the lamp. He began to mimic his son's flat accent, saying to himself, at the chapel, if you please." When the lamp was lit, he banged his fist on the table and shouted, "What's for my dinner?" "I'm going to cook it, Pa," said the little boy. The man jumped up furiously, pointed at the fire. "On that fire! You let the fire out, by God, I'll teach you to do that again." He took a step to the door and seized the walking stick which was standing behind it. "I'll teach you to let the fire out," he said, rolling up his sleeves in order to give his arm free play. The little boy cried, "Oh, Pa!" and ran whimpering around the table, and the man followed him, caught by the coat. The little boy looked around wildly, but seeing no way of escape, fell upon his supple knees. "Now you let the fire out next time," said the man, striking him vigorously with a stick. "Take that, you little whelp." The boy uttered a squeal of pain as the stick cut his thigh. Clasped his hands together in the air, and his voice shook with fright. "Oh, Pa," he cried, "don't beat me, Pa, and I'll say a Hail Mary for you. I'll say a Harry Mail for you, Pa. If you don't beat me, I'll say a Hail Mary."